You know, when you introduce a speaker, normally you give their credentials. I don't want to do that with Tony Shad, because Tony is an example of what this museum is supposed to be. I remember when Tony walked in one day, and I did not know this person, and he told me that he was crazy about corn. Okay. Tony grows heritage corn, which is really kind of cool, keeping old-time agricultural varieties. You know, we go to Papa Joe's and Nino's now to buy heritage tomatoes and that. Tony grows heritage corn. And wanted to know if he could have a portion of the garden to plant to heritage corn. Okay. That was the beginning of a wonderful friendship and a great relationship. I learned then that Tony also enjoys running around in a loincloth and portraying a Native American, and he does it quite well. Great legs. You learn a lot about people when they start to volunteer at a museum. He also has a passion for doing really good research and telling stories that a lot of people don't tell because they're not willing to get in there and do the nitty-gritty research. Tony is an example of the kind of people that find their way to a museum because they meet people who care about the same things that he cares about. He cares about traditions, he cares about history, about books, about telling stories to people, about sharing. He's fun to sit and have a cup of coffee with. He has come and volunteered at the museum and met lots of other people and endeared lots of kids to learning more about Native American culture. So with that introduction, would you please welcome a good friend, a wonderful volunteer, a great amateur historian, Mr. Tony Shad.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Generally, I preface my talks with, this is history according to Tony Shad, so I take a lot of liberties in presenting it. And what we'll be talking about tonight is St. Clair's defeat. That's one of the major topics in the talk. And it's not the lake St. Clair. It happens to be a Scotsman, Arthur St. Clair. And he was born in Scotland. And he had a horrendous defeat at the hands of the Indians, just about 150 miles southwest of Detroit. And in 1962, I was in a hardware store in Great Falls, Montana. And as I was looking around the walls, I noticed that around the walls they had all this 7th Cavalry paraphernalia, banners and swords and uniforms and things like that hanging from the walls. And I asked the gal behind the counter if she collected these items. And she replied, no, those are my grandfather's. And he was at the Battle of Little Bighorn. And I think most of us in this room know who George Armstrong Custer was. He was the leader of the United States 7th Cavalry. He grew up not far from Detroit, downriver in Monroe, Michigan, went to West Point, fought in the Civil War, and led the largest defeat of the U.S. Army at the hands of the Native American Indians, right? Well, on the slopes and shores of the Little Bighorn, which is a river in Montana, more than 1,200 miles west of Detroit, on the morning of June 25th, 1876, Custer led more than 200 men of the 7th Cavalry to their death. And I think most everyone has heard of Custer's Massacre. But very few of us have heard of this region's horrific battles. Battles between the original inhabitants and the American newcomers. Hundreds of battles took place over a 40-year span to ensure Detroit's place in the new United States. For example, the topic tonight is St. Clair's defeat. I call him Sinclair simply because that's the English way of saying saint. I call it the Battle of No Name because it really has no name. The results of the battle actually caused our first president, George Washington, to swear out loud. Arthur Sinclair was a Scotsman. He was born, obviously, in Scotland. He was a veteran of the American Revolutionary War. And when he was a young man, Arthur fled to the colonies to escape the typical and rampant class hatred warfare of the English-Scottish culture. As an officer in the Continental Army, Arthur's main claim to fame was during the Revolution. His claim to fame was giving up a strategic fort to the British without firing a shot. After the Revolution, for his services during the war, he was appointed the first governor of the Ohio Territory. Although a fairly brave man, his actions or inactions were responsible for the greatest defeat of the United States Army by native inhabitants in American history. His defeat led to the first ever U.S. congressional investigation. But of course, being the faithful government bureaucrat, Sinclair was eventually acquitted of all charges, and to make matters worse, he got his government job back again. In Van Tree's Banks of the Wabash, which I have a copy of up here, he states, Sinclair's battle was an absolute, unmitigated disaster for the new United States. Of 1,200 military effectives engaged on the Wabash, only 24 men returned uninjured. One of the curious things I find most interesting about Detroit is that most people think Detroit's history starts with the automobile. But by that time, the city was already 200 years old. Few people have any concept of Detroit as a colonial settlement. There was initially a race between the British, along with their Iroquois allies, to build a fort at Washtenaw, it's the actual word, and the French at a place called Detroit. The French beat them to it, and on July 24th, 1701, Cadillac stepped from a canoe and proclaimed the location of Fort Pontchartrain, smack in the middle of Amur Indian Territory. A map printed in 1702 was the first to show the location of La Detroit. And from the first, agriculture set Detroit apart from other locations in the interior, plus the arrival of French women shortly after the fort was built. No hanky-panky with the natives. The first incident of war in the Detroit area took place in 1712, when the Fox Indians and their allies blockaded Fort Pontchartrain. Eventually, the French, along with their Indian allies, annihilated the Fox in a battle along the riverside in what is now Grosse Pointe Park. By 1740, there were 100 families residing in and around Fort Detroit. Only after 1740 is there clear evidence that any Detroit resident felt safe enough to leave the fort to live full-time on their outlying farms. Until then, residents farmed their land during the daylight hours and spent the night in the security of the fort. In 1750, 49 years after it was established, Fort Detroit's population was 483 non-Indians, along with 33 slaves. If this slave ratio holds true for Detroit, about 22 slaves would have been Native American and 11 of African descent. And we'll talk about the slaves, these unfortunates, later on. In 1756, there was a registration campaign, and there were estimated to be an Indian population of well over 2,000 tending their crops, along with 500 to 600 warriors living in the vicinity of the fort. The French Empire had established many settlements out in the Western Territories by 1760. St. Louis, New Orleans, Mobile, and Kaskaskia out in the Illinois country were but a few of the Western trading locations. All these settlements were established after the fort at the Straits. Santa Claus coming? Oh. All these settlements were established after the fort at the Straits. Fort Pontchartrain was built. Fur trading and farming of wheat, corn, and fruit were the major industries. But on November 29th, 1760, after 59 years, 4 months, and 5 days, after Cadillac claimed the Straits, the French Empire departed Detroit. 38 blue-coated French Marines carrying the King of France's banner marched through Fort Detroit's main gate for the last time. With France's defeats at Quebec and Montreal to the British, the French citadel located between Lake St. Clair and Lake Erie became a memory. Detroit was absorbed into and became part of the expanding British Empire. And someone once told me the reason the sun never set on the British Empire was God didn't trust them in the dark. In 1760, other than the trading posts at Fort Michilimackinac, Fort St. Joseph, located on the western side of Michigan, and Sault Ste. Marie, Detroit was a city. It was a farming community and a commercial center, and it stood alone in the forest. At that time, Detroit had existed for 59 years. Chicago didn't exist. Its future location was still a flat, weedy, muddy, mosquito-plagued river inlet into Lake Michigan. Cincinnati was an empty, grassy slope on the north side of the Ohio River. Fort Wayne was a place to carry canoes between the Wabash River and the Maumee River. And Toledo, Windsor, Lansing, and even Cleveland were places of trees, cattail plants, and swamps. St. Louis and New Orleans were vacant places on the Mississippi River. And I'd like to see a t-shirt someday that reads, Detroit, 1701, a city when yours was only an empty swamp. Yes, when the fort was built in 1701, there were a few other existing settlements, but they were along the East Coast. Settlements up in New England, along the Atlantic coast, and down in Savannah, but absolutely nothing established west of the Appalachian Mountains. And you can imagine in 1701, when Detroit was settled, you could hike westward from the then small town of Philadelphia over the Appalachian Mountains and walk and walk and walk until you reach the Mississippi River and never encounter another European. You would be walking through the virgin forests of the future states of Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. No Europeans, but there were a lot of other people living there. Now, the original inhabitants of this area were members of the Algonquin Nation, which means they talked the same language, dialect, and had a common DNA. They consisted of groups of people called Delaware, Ottawa, Ojibwa, Potawatomi, Miami, and Shawnee. Farther to the west, they included the Sauk, the Fox, the Kaskaskia, the Winnebagos, known later as the Traveling Camper Tribe, the Peoria, the Illinois, and the Chicago tribes. The typical Amerindian village would break down to a mixture of tribal members, those of pure Amerindian lineage, and those included warriors such as Tecumseh, Little Turtle, Pontiac, Corn Planter, Blue Jacket, and others that belonged to this category. And warriors were tasked with hunting and protecting the tribes. Women held the wealth of the tribes in the form of land. They grew the food and actually ran the political functions in the camp. They were not the helpless females of our imagination. And then there were the adoptive captives. Boys and girls captured during warfare or trade and adopted into the tribe. Wild Carrot, so named because his red hair, was born William Wells in Kentucky, He was captured as a young boy during an Indian raid. He was adopted and fought on the Indian side during various battles, including Sinclair's defeat. Later in life, he became a major Indian agent for the Americans in the Northwest Territory. He has a street named after him in Chicago. Another adoptee was Simon Girty. He later became the boogeyman of the Northwest Territory because of his fanatical support of the Amerindians. As a youngster, he was captured during the French and Indian War and raised by Delawares. Simon eventually became a British Indian agent working out of Detroit, and he was considered a loyal British servant for his entire life. Andy is buried on his farm across the Detroit River near the city of Amherstburg, Ontario. And there are absolutely no streets named after him in Ohio, Michigan, or Indiana. Maybe a cow path or an alley, but no streets. Many of the adopted girls who became women and mothers living with the tribes were forcibly repatriated to the civilized English settlement after the French and Indian War. Some tried to return to the Amerindian way of life, where a woman was treated as an equal rather than a possession. Another tribal category was that of other Amerindians or non-Amerindian members who voluntarily joined the activities of the tribe. Entrance to the tribe was either through marriage, political allegiance, or cultural acceptance. Many French traders and trappers assimilated into the Great Lakes tribe in this method. And one Shawnee warrior by the name of Caesar was an escaped African slave. Alexander McKee and Matthew Elliott were two examples of British Europeans joining a tribe through marriage. Both remained loyal to the British Crown during the Revolutionary War and later became members of the British Indian Department out of Detroit. McKee was married to a Delaware Indian, and Matthew married a Wyandot woman. Then there were those who were half European and half Amerindian as a result of these unions. There were many people of this classification. Thomas McKee, Alexander's son, is an example of this group. Unfortunately, Americans came to look down on these half-breeds as somewhat less than human. But these two tribal groups, the adopted and half European, half Amerindian tribal members, would have a powerful impact on the future of the Native Americans. So an Amerindian tribe would consist of many types of members, but if one was welcomed into the tribe and then rejected the tribe, it was an automatic death sentence. Finally, of the last two categories, they were the most tragic. They were also captives, and the first of those were killed at tribal events, and they were called Katahota, the dead people. They were men or women who were covered with black marks and tortured to death. These captives faced a slow and miserable death, and that was death by fire. And generally, this activity lasted a day or two. And so it was a very long and very slow death from roasting. Plus, there was no reprieve. And last, those destined for a short life of exceptional toil, mind-numbing drudgery, and terror. The slaves. These people were generally older people who were captured in the wars between feuding tribes or raids on the settler location, or actually bartered through trade. And their only hope for survival was to be adopted by tribal members. Contrary to public opinion, it was not only the American colonialists who practiced slavery. Slavery's been rampant throughout the world from time immemorial. It even continues today in some places in the Middle East and Africa. The word slave is derived from the Roman or Latin term for Slavs. And yes, as the census points out, we had 33 slaves in Detroit in the 1750 census. By 1760, when the French flag was lowered for the last time at Fort Detroit, Towards the Atlantic coast, eastern relatives of the Great Lakes Algonquin Nation, and that is relatives of the Indians living in this area, had been fighting the encroaching white settlers for almost 125 years. The Pilgrims had learned the survival skills of the New World, and once they learned that, they coveted the natives' land. The idea of owning Mother Earth was unthinkable to the Amerindians. Occasionally, a gift of land usage was given to the newcomers, but to sell the land was as foreign as selling the sky. In this first New England colonialist war, thousands of Amerindians were killed. The remaining thousands of Pequot men, women, and children who survived were sold as slaves by the Pilgrims to the sugar-growing estates in the Caribbean. In Red, White, and Black, author Gary Nash infers, enslaving the Amerindians was a common practice in the act of the colonialists. It was a cash business, and demand from the sugar growers in the Caribbean for workers was brisk. During the 17th and 18th century, Indian warfare and European warfare were generally two distinctly different activities. The Europeans stood in straight lines in open fields and blasted away with smooth-bore muskets at the straight lines of their opponents. Europeans were also great proponents of siege warfare. In Europe, siege warfare was a common practice during the war. One army would surround an enemy town or city, and the surrounding army would try to cut off all food and water from and simply wait out the inhabitants to sue for peace. And I guess one could call it fighting at a distance. Indians, on the other hand, because of their small numbers, generally practice short, intense, in-your-face attacks. Fast attacks, coming from an ambush position, get in fast with overwhelming ferocity. Up close, one-on-one fighting, and leave just as rapidly. Hit-and-run attacks, guerrilla warfare. Amerindian war was up close and personal. This kind of war was totally foreign to the European fighting physique. Paint was worn as a disguise. Red paint, black paint, white paint were used to cover facial characteristics. Who knows, in a year or two, you could be having a peaceful dinner with a former enemy, and you wouldn't want a past indiscretion to spoil the festivities. One major saving grace for the early settlers was the warrior's reluctance and distaste to fight at night, because his religion taught him that the forest was inhabited at night by evil spirits. Therefore, as a general rule, he attacked at sun and retired at sundown. And although the French had enjoyed cordial relations with the Amerindians of the Great Lakes, the British Empire viewed all the original Amerindian inhabitants in a less than positive image. But on the other hand, the original people viewed the newcomers as less than trustworthy. Gary Nash's book, Red, White, and Black, he identifies the root word Yankee, the enduring term Yankee, who New Englanders are so proud of, as Nash describes, is derived from a Delaware Indian word meaning lower than a snake's belly. So cultural relations between both sides were very tense. As one of the three major warring factions of the French and Indian War, the Amerindians were left out of the peacemaking process. This oversight contributed to one of the first unique distinctions Detroit holds in its early history. With the British looking down on the natives, it was an absolute shock for the British Empire that an unsophisticated local yokel by the name of Pontiac succeeded in uniting far-flung Great Lakes tribes into a single force to challenge the British rule. Pontiac planned, coordinated, and attacked all the British outposts located in the country. Fort Detroit has a number of unique historical distinctions, and one of those distinctions is that of withstanding prolonged siege warfare from the Native Americans. In the spring of 1763, Pontiac led a confederation of Great Lakes tribes in the hopes of throwing the British out of the Northwest. British posts at Green Bay, Michilimackinac, St. Joseph, Fort Wyattton, Fort Miami, Fort LeBoeuf, Fort Venego, and Fort Sandusky all fell, except Detroit and Fort Pitt. And after 153 bloody days, Pontiac's siege of Detroit was finally lifted. In 1768, the Fort Stanwix Agreement between the British and the Amerindians set the boundaries of expansion for the white settlers. No white settlers would farm any Ohio country. Right. In his book, White Devil, Stephen Bromwell explains, even though the British government tried to prevent settlement in Indian territory, as soon as the French and Indian War was over, Europeans burst through the Appalachian mountain passes or down the Ohio River Valley from Pittsburgh. Free land and a new start was the magical reward dangling in front of the many English and Scots-Irish yeomen who flooded into the American colonies. Bromwell identifies one ethnic group and states from 1680 to 1776, more than 150,000 Scots-Irish moved to the British colonies. Until the completion of the Erie Canal years later, settlements in the interior of the Ohio country spread north from the shores of the Ohio River towards Detroit. What initially had kept the immigrants to the coastal American colonies from surging into the interior is one of the oldest mountain ranges in the world. 480 million years old, the Appalachian Mountain Range runs 1,200 miles from Canada down to Alabama, and initially prevented large-scale intrusion into the interior of the American continent. Until 1750 and the discovery of the Cumberland Gap, there was no known easy access to the interior of the American continent other than going over the mountains. Kentucky, which for years was the exclusive hunting preserve of regional Amerindians, was the first sacristy to be ruptured by the new settlers. Initially, only traders and long hunters such as Daniel Boone and Simon Kenton penetrated the Ohio and Kentucky lands. But once the Cumberland Gap was discovered, settlers flooded through the gap to gobble up what they considered to be unclaimed land. The newcomers not only cut down the trees and sliced into Mother Earth, they inadvertently hunted out the local game, pushing the Amerindians' way of life to the brink of extermination. Detroit at the time of the American Revolution was still a settled outpost in the wilderness. It was a farming and trading center for the British Empire. Overland, a small trail through the woods allowing east-west travel, which later became known as the Great Sauk Trail. Initially used by the Amerindians living in the Illinois and Wisconsin country. They used the trail to travel to Detroit for trading purposes, running down from Wisconsin and around the bottom of Lake Michigan, and then east to Detroit. We now call it US Highway 12. In 1773, just before the outbreak of the American Revolution, the Detroit settlement, not including members of Fort Laurent, which was the British fort, held a population of 1,367 traders, trappers, and farmers. And by 1776, Detroit's population had grown to 1,500 white residents, along with 85 slaves. As the Revolutionary War progressed, a Grand Council was held in Detroit on June 14, 1778. British Lieutenant Governor Harry Hamilton, later known as Hairbuyer Hamilton, urged over 1,000 Amerindians assembled before him to take the war axe of your father, the King of England, and strike a blow against the Americans. And guess how Hairbuyer Hamilton got his name? From buying scalps. Thousands of people had their hair lifted in New York, Pennsylvania, and Kentucky during the Revolution. Hair bought by Hamilton and sent to England. And a popular item in London during the American Revolution and a few years afterwards was a particular style of purse used by the British upper class to hold coins. It consisted of the dried skin from the top of a rebel's head, hair and all, and it was commonly called a scalp. It's the top of your head that holds up your face. And the scalping process involves running a sharp knife around the crown of someone's head and then leaning over and stepping on the person's back and yanking real hard and pulling the top of his head off. The scalping process involved horrible terror to the person whose head is getting yanked off or head is getting. Once a person was scalped, the unfortunate person's face fell because nothing was holding it up anymore. So scalping was a very bloody and gory process. And the shock of the action by itself could bring death. It is said the practice was introduced in North America by the Dutch, trading out of New Amsterdam. And who would have thought today that some people would pay a lot of money to do reverse scalping, but now we call it a facelift, and it's a popular item with some of the elites in Washington. During the Revolution, the going price paid by the British in Detroit for a rebel scalp was generally $10. A live rebel captive brought a price of $15. Hair buyer Hamilton was eventually captured by George Rogers Clark in the winter of 1778. He was sent to Virginia as a war criminal, but he was eventually released and reappointed by the British as the Governor General of Canada. Along with the profits from the fur that the British were purchasing from the Indians, there was also profit from the muskets, the gunpowder, and other trade items to the Native Americans. Because of the bounties placed on scalp, the taking of scalps from all ages and sexes soon became somewhat of a business on the frontier. In some cases, the colonialists, later the Americans, offered bounties on Indian scalps. But the greatest trafficking in scalps came as a result of bounties placed on them by the British. In 1779, after the outbreak of the Revolutionary War, Detroit's population, including 500 prisoners and 332 members of the garrison, was 2,653 people. And where did these prisoners come from, these 500 prisoners? Well, we've all traveled up and down I-75. And the original path for the existing of I-75 was a path created by the Woodlands Indians. And they were a smaller version of the Plains buffalo. The trail was created by the buffalo. And they traveled in small herds. And they created the paths that I-75 is made from. Branching east off of I-75 at Findlay, Ohio, and then running parallel to I-75 is a rarely traveled highway, US 68. The original inhabitants gave it the name the Warrior Road. Captives from Kentucky were herded along this road from the various southern settlements to Detroit. And it runs from Maysville, Kentucky to Detroit. Daniel Boone was dragged along this road when he was a captive. One of the last battles of the American Revolution took place in Kentucky. Amur Indians, along with the British troops and a loyalist troop of Butler's Rangers, participated in the Battle of Blue Licks on the Licking River in Kentucky. They marched south from the fort at Detroit through the Ohio country and then paddled across the Ohio River and up the Licking River to a salt lick in Kentucky. The river they traveled up is located across the Ohio River from today's Cincinnati Sports Stadium. Once the British troops arrived at the place called Blue Licks, they defeated a troop of Kentucky militia and returned to the fort in Detroit. When the American Revolution ended, In 1783, Detroit's population had stabilized at 2,291 inhabitants. The reason we here in this room don't end our sentences with an A, or pay our bills with the loon, or belong to the Canadian National Health Program is John Adams. Thanks to John, during the Treaty of Paris negotiations, he said no to the Ohio River Treaty Line. He held out for the treaty lines to run through the Great Lakes, with the exception of Lake Michigan, and west to the Mississippi River. Not, as everyone else suggested, the Ohio River. This land west of Fort Pittsburgh and north of the Ohio River became to be referred to by historians as the Old Northwest Territory. After the Revolution, the British held on to Detroit until, they said, repatriations were given to their Tory loyalist supporters. And when it was convenient, they would leave Detroit. But in actuality, the British Empire was making a ton of money through the Indian trade. And son of a gun, when the Treaty of Paris of 1783 officially ended the Revolutionary War, neither the British nor the Americans made provisions for the many tribes who had supported either of their efforts. Shades of the French and Indian War. And treaties are imperfect solutions, and the 1783 treaty did not end all hostilities between the U.S. and England. Today, we think, and I included myself, that as soon as the Revolutionary War ended, all was peaches and cream between the British and the United States. You know, we were playing kissy face out in the woods and that sort of thing. And that was absolutely wrong. The British despised us. We beat them. They were the most professional army in the world, and they were beaten by a ragtag group of farmer warriors and newly trained soldiers. They weren't even professional soldiers, and they beat them. We took their pride, we took their honor, and they loathed us for that. They wanted to punish the U.S., and the U.S. was sanctioned from all British goods, and no British colony was permitted to engage with U.S. trade. The British Department established an Indian Department located in Detroit. The Indian agent's major task was to encourage, foment, and support the regional tribes in resisting the American expansion. As far as the Indians were concerned, the British had concluded a peace treaty with the Americans, but their war against the intruding American settlers still continued. The land south of the Ohio River was being overrun by Americans pouring through the Cumberland Gap out of Virginia, or settlers floating down the Ohio River from Pittsburgh. And the newcomers' watchword was free land. But this free land was costly. It is estimated that between 1783 and 1790, as many as 1,500 settlers died in Kentucky and Ohio from Indian attacks. And you kind of wonder who bought those scalps. We today have a quaint popular term used to describe a wonderful, enjoyable autumn weather. We say it's Indian summer, but to the early settlers of this country, the meaning was much, much different. Indian summer and the accompanying good weather brought savage guerrilla surprise attacks from the Amerindians. By 1787, the American Congress had enacted the Northwest Ordinance. Their hopes was to encourage development of the region. This territory consisted of the future states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, and Michigan. But by 1787, the Old Northwest had also become a melting pot of tribes after the Revolution. Northern and eastern tribes, the Ottawa, the Ojibwe, Wyandot, Algonquin, Delaware, and the remnants of the Iroquois League were now mingled here, along with the Miami, Ways, Peckensaw, Potawatomi, Menominee, Kickapoo, Illinois, Peoria, Kaskaskia, Sauk, Fox, Winnebago, into the south in the Ohio, the Shawnees. The Indians had lost their Kentucky lands and all their ancestral lands in the east. Now they were being pushed away from the land north of the Ohio River. Attacks on the American newcomers, both in Kentucky and now north of the Ohio River, continued unabated. In 1790, President George Washington ordered an expedition outfitted with the purpose of pacifying the hostile Indians of the northwest frontier. And so started the first major American Amerindian conflict, Little Turtle's War. Little Turtle was a Miami chief, and he, as Pontiac before him, had created an alliance with the other tribes in Ohio, Michigan, and Indiana. The British father, through his Indian agents in Detroit, gleefully supplied equipment for this war. The British also promised, unofficially of course, to supply troops to support Little Turtle's effort. And I'll bet most people in this room tonight had a boss who, as I said these wonderful words, "I'll give you as much help as I can." And like many of us, Little Turtle failed to ask, what do you mean by that? Down on the banks of the Ohio, Cincinnati, first known as Loannisville, was established on a muddy riverbank in 1788. It was 87 years after Fort Detroit was established. Fort Washington, outside of Cincinnati, was a staging area for the expulsion of the remaining Amerindians. First up to bat against Team Little Turtle was Josiah Harmer, another Revolutionary War hero. And hoping to rid the Ohio of the Indians, Brigadier General Harmer left Fort Washington in Cincinnati with a force of 1,100 militiamen, volunteers from Pennsylvania, Virginia, and Kentucky. By definition, the United States militia is made up of all male citizens between 18 and 45 who are not in the military. Along with the militia, there were 300 or so regular Army troops. Harmer's objective was to defeat and chase Little Turtle and his allied Amerindians away from the Maumee River Valley. In two surprise September 1790 ambushes up in the Fort Wayne, Indiana area, the Amerindians routed Harmer, killing 183 of his troops and wounding 31 more. Indians 1, invaders 0. Next to battle Little Turtle was our old revolutionary friend, our hero, Arthur Sinclair. One of Sinclair's claim to fame was that he changed the name of Loannisville to that of Cincinnati. In the autumn of 1791, Sinclair left Cincinnati with approximately 2,000 poorly trained troops. These troops of militia had signed up for a 6-month war. Marching with these short-timer troops was the newly formed 2nd United States Regiment. On the way to meet Little Turtle's force, they built Fort Jefferson and Fort Hamilton, Ohio, as supply bases. The weather was absolutely horrid. It was cold, it was rainy, and it was snowy. And along the way to the battle, droves of the 6-month militia deserted. Then, on the evening of November 2nd, 1791, after days of marching north, the remaining 1,200-member army camped on the snow-covered eastern side of the high ground of the upper Wabash River. And that's where it curves from Ohio into, from out of Indiana into Ohio. Located about 150 miles southwest from Detroit, it was a flat, tree-filled area. And in their haste to make camp, Sinclair's exhausted army failed to take defensive measures, which is still today standard practice in any war-active area. Early the next morning, 1,200 Amerindians, led by Little Turtle, slammed into the 1,200 invaders. Shrieking war cries, the Amerindians forded the Maumee River, and fell upon the unprotected and poorly trained troops. They hacked, they slashed, they shot, they tomahawked, and they stabbed the panicked Sinclair army. By late morning of November 3rd, 1791, after 3 hours of horrific hand-to-hand combat, Sinclair's defeated troops were fleeing to Fort Jefferson, 29 miles away. Because the number of men had deserted St. Clair's force, the total losses were impossible to determine. In the Adjutant General's post-battle report, he reported almost 1,200 combatants were killed, wounded, or missing. Only 34 combatants returned uninjured. Plus, of the approximately 250 women, children, cattle drivers, and other non-military personnel who followed the Army, only 3 women have known to survive the ferocious 3-hour attack. The Amerindian losses were calculated at 66. The Amerindians had just achieved their greatest victory in their many wars against the white. But the Amerindians failed to follow up their unbelievable triumph and attack and drive all the settlers out of the Northwest Territories. Rather than follow the defeated survivors, Little Turtle shouted, "Enough! Enough killing for today!" And he let the surviving enemies escape. The price for scalps in Detroit plummeted after Sinclair's defeat from $10 to $5. The 600-plus Americans killed during the battle lay on the ground in the bloody snow where they fell in the field next to the Wabash River. And the score was Amerindians 2, invaders 0. Next up to bat was General Mad Anthony Wayne. He built, over a time, a formidable force of 3,000 well-equipped and well-trained men. And then Wayne moved. More than 2 years passed after Sinclair's defeat before the whites felt secure enough to return to the Maumee River battlefield. The detachment Wayne sent forward to begin construction of Fort Recovery arrived at the site of Sinclair's defeat on Christmas Day, 1793. They pitched their tents on the battlefield, but before they could lie down, they had to scrape together the scattered bones and carry them outside. The next day, holes were dug and the bones remaining above ground were buried, including 600 human skulls. Then they constructed Fort Recovery. Today, the site of Sinclair's camp is a cornfield. The area from where Little Turtle launched his attack is on the site of a Ralston Purina dog food plant. The state of Ohio did place a monument over the site of the bone burial in the early 1900s. Meanwhile, the United States tried to negotiate a settlement to end the war. American representatives were sent to Detroit, and a grand conference of tribes of the Northwest and Canada was convened. But the native tribes insisted that the United States respect the British Fort Stanwix Agreement of 1768. No settlers in Ohio, like that was going to happen. On his way to battle, Wayne built another fort in the Ohio country and exclaimed, "I defy the British, the Indians, and all the devils in hell to take it." And Wayne called the structure Fort Defiance. Today, the location where the two warring factions met on August 20th, 1794, is a trailer park in a big empty field off the Toledo intersection of I-475 and Ohio Highway 24. Taking the advice of one of his scouts, William Wells, that was Wild Carrot, I don't know if you remember him, he was one of the adopted Shawnee Indians. With Wells' advice, Wayne defeated the combined Indian forces. Wells told the general, "Where the Indians are going to attack is a place called Fallen Timbers. A tornado went through the area a few years back. The trees are all tangled up, and it's a hell of a place to do a battle. But soon as you camp, the evening before, the Indians will start preparing for the upcoming battle. They will hold a war dance and paint up and start their fast. They don't like food in their bellies when they go into battle, so they won't eat. Thing is, they'll be expecting you to attack the next morning. But you stay put, and they'll be getting hungrier all the time. They won't eat that whole day, waiting for you to strike. Then they'll go the whole night, again, waiting for you to strike. Maybe 30 or 40 hours without food. It'll weaken them, and it'll help you. Wayne marched down the Maumee River and reached Fallen Timbers on the afternoon of August 18th. He stopped within striking distance of the Indian camp, 2 miles upstream from the British-built Fort Miami. He pitched his camp and, taking Wells' advice, waited. For 2 days, Wayne waited. The night before he attacked, fierce thunderstorms rolled through the area, drenching the Indians crouching behind the trees, while Wayne's forces remained relatively comfortable in their tents. Wayne attacked the morning of August 20th. By that time, because of hunger and fatigue, Indian resolve had plummeted. Of the original 2,000 warriors, only about 1,300 remained, the rest having melted into the surrounding fields and woods. A fierce but surprisingly brief battle ensued. So swiftly was the Indians' resistance broken that Wayne hadn't had time to complete his strategy. The warriors fled to the British Fort Miami, located a few miles down the Maumee River from the present-day Toledo. Other than a small number of Canadian militiamen and Indian agents supporting Little Turtle, the British troops never materialized. You remember these words? I'll give you as much help as I can. The British in the fort refused admittance to their Indian allies. After hundreds of Indians were killed and the Indians defeated, Wayne told the British to get out of the American territory. A year later, in Fort Greenville, Ohio, the Amerindians signed away the vast majority of Ohio. And so, 13 years after the Treaty of Annapolis ended the American Revolution in 1783, Detroit was finally absorbed into the new American nation. For a second time, a commanding officer at Detroit awaited the approach of a former enemy to whom he would surrender his post. Major Porter, the United States Army, first proprietor of the Porter Street Station, accepted the title to Fort Laurent, the British fort at Fort Detroit, on July 11th, 1796. He accepted the surrender from a colonel of all ironic names, Colonel Richard England. When Colonel Hamtramck arrived later, Detroit's population had plummeted to 500. The majority of British population had fled across the river to Sandwich, which is present-day Ontario, Windsor, or elsewhere. And they should have stuck around because it was rumored Hamtramck brought the recipe for punchkis with him, and ironically, he did die of a heart attack while in command of the post. Once the British left Detroit, their troops marched down the future Sandwich Street, over the Ojibway Parkway, past the future home of the Windsor Raceway, and onto the gateway of Babilo Island. There they built Fort Amherstburg. Across from the fort is an island we remember as Babilo Island. What's interesting is the channel between the fort and the island is the main shipping channel connecting Lake Erie with all the other Great Lakes. Therefore, although they were kicked out of Detroit, the British troops stationed at Fort Amherstburg still controlled all the shipping on the Great Lakes. And there at Fort Amherstburg, now called Fort Malden, today open to the public, the British government continued to support the British Indian Department, and still smarting from their defeat in the Revolution 13 years before, this British government department would, viewed from the American side of the Detroit River, still have a tremendous negative impact on the future of Detroit. Any questions so far? Good, because I'm into collusion now. In doing research for this paper, I found something interesting. That the slavery part of the American Indians was kind of interesting. Not only were Indians hunted down and captured and sold as slaves in New England, in the southern states, slaving expeditions were led from Savannah, Georgia, much like slaving expeditions in Africa. Southern Amerindians were captured and again sold to the Caribbean islanders for their sugar plantations. And the enslavement of Amerindians continued throughout the years of expansion of European settlers from the Atlantic to the Pacific. From 1750 to 1869, Los Angeles maintained an Indian slave market on Mondays. The United States Congress outlawed the enslavement of Navajos by Americans and Mexicans through a joint resolution of Congress on July 27, 1868, 3 years after the end of the Civil War. Fighting between U.S. troops and the Amerindians continued off and on for the rest of the 19th century. The last battle between the U.S. Army and the indigenous Amerindian forces occurred up in Wisconsin in the year 1898, 102 years after Detroit was occupied and brought into the new American fold. And thank you for your time.